In this video, we'll take a look at how to add guide geometry to our OTL. Currently, there's a weakness in our setup. If we display a control point, you'll notice that we can't actually see where it is. Now we can kind of get an idea of where it is by selecting it and hitting enter in the viewport and getting our handle to come up, but it's a bit annoying that we have to do this, and we can't just see where it is if we have it displayed. So the way that we can get around this is by adding guide geometry. So what is guide geometry exactly? Well, let's take a look at an example of guide geometry. So one of the Houdini nodes that uses guide geometry is the ray sop. So I'm just going to come over here and put down a ray sop. And let's just make a sphere and wire it into the first input, and a grid and wire it into the second input. Now if we display the ray sop, so you can see that our sphere is actually there, the way that we would expect, but there's also this blue outline of the grid. Now this blue outline doesn't actually affect anything in that it's not an output of the geometry for this ray sop. The only thing that's coming out of this ray sop is the sphere. But the blue geometry the blue wireframe is there kind of as a guide to show the collision geometry that the sphere is going to be projected against. So we can set up the same thing for our OTLs if we just go ahead and delete these and come back over here, display this control point. So the first thing that we'll need is geometry to actually be the guide. So if we dive inside of our control point OTL, and all we have to do is create some geometry that represents where this point is. So the simplest way to do that is to just copy a sphere onto it. So let's do a sphere, and then let's add a copy sop. Wire the sphere into the first input, and then wire the old output into the second input of the copy sop. Display the copy sop. Oh, okay, there's our sphere. And I'm just gonna go to the attribute tab and turn on use template point attributes to get it to use the color. Now currently the color is not actually enabled for this one, so let's just go upstairs here, go to the color tab and enable the color. So now if we come back in, our sphere is colored green, because that's the color that we picked. Alright, I'm just going to name our copy sop here. So copy guide to control point, just to make it easy to read. Okay, so something kind of interesting has happened here. So what we're going to need to do is reference the geometry that we want to use as our guide, and we'll do that in a second. But it would be really nice if we could create a hook in this setup to actually reference. And the reason for that is it could be that we want to put other nodes after this copy sop. And if that's the case, then it'll be really nice to have a node that's just always referenced that we can make sure is at the end of the chain. So if you remember, what we can use for that is a null sop. So let's create a null sop, wire it in, and we can just call it in capitals guide out. And then if we hit the C key, remember we always color null sops dark blue. Now, here comes the interesting part, and that's because now we have this guide out, but there's nothing that actually says where the output of the setup is. And someone reading this might go all the way down here to the bottom, see a null at the bottom, and think, oh, this is the output of the setup, even if I have the display flag and the render flag up here on the point that I actually want to send as the output. So in order to make this clear, let's just add another null sop and wire it into the actual output for the setup. Because remember, these nodes are only here as a guide, and in fact, I'm just going to move them way off here so it's clear that they're not part of this chain. So now, if I just call this one out, and again, color it blue. And then we'll just display that one. It's pretty clear that this is the actual output of the setup, and this is only here for guides. Okay, so if we come back out, let's just right click on our control point node here and say save operator type, and that'll add that same geometry to all these other nodes. If you don't believe me, we can just dive inside, and you can see there's the guide geometry here and our new out null here. Okay, so if we come back out to the explosions network, now let's add the guide to our OTL. So if we go back to our type properties dialog, where it says guide geometry here, this is where we actually specify a path to the geometry that it's going to display as a guide. Now notice that this guide geometry has to actually be contained by the node that we're currently editing. So we launched type properties dialog from this node here, so it has to be some node inside of this. So I couldn't, for example, give it this merge or some other random node in my network. It has to be inside this one. So we can either give it a relative path here, or we can pick it from a menu using this little button here. So if we click that button, notice that it selects the node that we're currently editing by default, and that allows us to just go inside it straight away. And now notice that all the capitalized nodes are at the top, and this is why I always capitalize nulls. Because usually, whenever I'm inside this dialog, I'm referencing nulls. So if they're capitalized, then they're always at the top of the list where I can find them easily. So the one that we want is guide out, so if we select that one, hit accept, you'll notice that it puts a relative path in here for that one. And now if I hit accept on the type properties dialog, you can see that our guide geometry is there. And now whether we have our handle displayed or not, we can instantly see where our point is. Now the cool thing about this is that I can change the representation that Houdini is going to use for the guide geometry anytime I want to, so it doesn't have to be a sphere. I could turn it into a box or a circle or whatever I want to, really easily. And the way that I do that is, if we go back into the control point OTL, we just change what it's going to be copied into, and since it's referencing this guide out null, it's just going to automatically update itself. So if we swap out the sphere for a box, like this, and then come back out, and then right click and say save operator type, you'll notice it's a box now.